Oh, sure. Oh, sure. But I'll tell you something. What I'm hearing today and listening to these people that have suffered, the victims, okay? I think it's sick. It sucks. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say, that they won't cut me off here.
Welcome to Cracklin' Rosie True Crime. We had a great response to our Neysa Moskowitz video, and that inspired me to dig even deeper, pull some loose ties together, and bring you part 2 today. Let's get started. We are going to do a quick summary for those who missed part 1. If you didn't get a chance to see that video, I highly recommend that you do when you have time, but we will do a quick recap. In part 1, we talked about who Neysa Moskowitz was, obviously the mother of Son of Sam victim Stacy Moskowitz. We briefly touched on her family and her losses. We will go a little bit deeper into that. I was able to dig up a little bit more information, and that might tie up some loose ends. We spoke of her tenacity and what an advocate she was for justice. She wanted justice for her daughter. The main topic of part 1 was covering 2 reported attacks against Neysa Moskowitz by alleged cult members. So we talked about that, and we went into pretty great detail on that. We covered the relationship between David Berkowitz and Neysa Moskowitz. We talked about all this forgiveness and redaction of forgiveness and what was really the story there. So what I've done, I did dig up some more information and I've put it in a good timeline order. So we're going to also fill in some gaps there. So that's a quick summary. Again, I totally encourage you to watch part 1, but you don't have to leave us now because we'll be covering enough information that if you're familiar with the case, you should be able to catch on. If you know nothing about what I mentioned in the summary, maybe you should watch part 1 first. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to get my presentation up on screen and we are going to go through it. I am psyched and ready to go. I have today's presentation queued up on the screen. In case for reference, I have Neysa Part 1 queued up on the screen, and then a few pictures and slides that I put together to help support this presentation. Thank you so much for all of the comments and all of the feedback based on this Neysa 1 video. I've also put together a full page of notes, which will help clarify the timeline a little bit. I was able to fill in some holes. Keep in mind that in some places we have to use our brain a little bit because things are all over the place. News periodicals have been republished, so we have to go back in time and put it in context. What was going on at that time? So I spent some time doing that, and I hope to share that with you, and I hope that you get value out of today's presentation. Let's do this. Again, I'd like to give a shout out to the viewers. It's because of your comments, your interaction, and your questions that I chose to go deeper, and I'm going to be able to fill in some gaps for you today, so thank you so much. I put together this community chatter. I'm not going to read it on air. You all could read, but it will be something that will pop up perhaps monthly on our community page. Mostly, I'm using it as a reference because some thoughts are so good that I may want to share them in my presentation, and I want to be sure that the appropriate people get the shout out. So what's going to happen is we will jump a little bit back and forth, and then I will summarize at the end with the timeline in chronological order. So remember, Neysa died in September of 2006. We touched on how sad her life was and how much trauma she experienced. That was one of the biggest comments and feedback that I got back from the community. Now, when we spoke of her family, we went through it quickly, and so I did dig a little bit more just to cover it with a little more reverence and just in greater detail. So we know she outlived all three of her daughters and her husband. And I've got little snippets of information on each one, but there wasn't a whole lot. Okay, we'll start with Jody Lynn, which is her second-born daughter, first to pass away. This article basically talks about when Neysa passed away, so it's going back in history. When Berkowitz struck in 1977, Neysa had already buried the first of her three daughters, Jody, a decade before. Friends said she eventually committed suicide. And that was 1968. Next was Stacy Robin Moskowitz. We will go in great detail when I show you the slide from the timeline. So in the mid-1990s, that's what this says, but according to my estimation, it would have had to been early 90s. So early 90s, Neysa moved with her husband Jerry to Florida. Jerry died of a heart ailment. So Jerry died 1994. They moved to Florida early 90s, and within a few years, she loses her husband after burying two daughters. So imagine that. They're probably making plans to settle down, live the rest of their life out in Florida, and a few years later, she loses her husband. Then I'm going to jump back there. She also outlived Ricky Beth, and that's the one that you see in a lot of the articles on the sofa with Mr. and Mrs. Moskowitz, and she was very present at the time of Stacy's death. She was around 16 at that time. And in that same snippet, it said Ricky developed scleroderma, which is a fatal disease of the immune system. And Ricky died about 7 years ago. So that was 7 years prior to Neysa's passing in 2006. And then Neysa, according to this and according to other sources, she died of breast cancer. So the final thing I'll share in this section is the Dade County Medical Examiner's Office will perform an autopsy because of a suspicious amount of drugs in her system, although foul play is not suspected. So let me just back that up, and you have to remember she was suffering and at the final stages of breast cancer. So it could be very possible that those were the medications and painkillers to help her cope with the cancer. And then before we move on to the next part of this presentation, of course, I'll just share this with you. Let me just get this over so we can see it a little bit better. Okay. And this is the famous picture of Ricky, Neysa, and Jerry sitting on the sofa. And here is where they learn that David Berkowitz was arrested for the crimes. All right. So this is Neysa Moskowitz with her attorney, Spencer Lader. This is part of the presentation that I was really looking forward to sharing. So based on this New York Times article titled, "Victims' Parents Tell Yonkers They Will Sue." Let me just make this a little bit bigger so that I can see it. The parents of Stacy Moskowitz, the last victim of the Son of Sam killer, plans to sue the city of Yonkers for $10 million, charging that its police department failed to follow up complaints against David Berkowitz, accused of being the killer. Stacy Moskowitz would be alive today if the police had done an adequate and proper job in following up on a major lead, said Spencer Lader, a lawyer representing the dead girl's parents. Mr. Lader said Sam Carr of Yonkers, a neighbor of Mr. Berkowitz, had complained to police 3 or 4 months ago that his dog had been shot and had told them a month and a half before the Moskowitz slaying that he suspected Mr. Berkowitz to be the so-called 44 caliber killer. They should have made a proper investigation and didn't, he said. Mr. Lader said notice of the claim had been filed with the city of Yonkers and that he had a year and 90 days to file the suit. Okay, guys, I popped off the screen for a bit because obviously, as you can see, I'm having a little bit of lighting issue, but I do want to finish this portion. So I want to let you know that that was dated August 17th, 1977. So barely at the end of the month, they were already into this lawsuit, or this potential lawsuit of $10 million with Yonkers. So makes it very interesting for me. I wasn't able to find anything that this led anywhere. We obviously know that Mrs. Moskowitz died relatively poor, so I'm guessing that nothing ever came out of this. However, on other issues that I'm researching, this really sheds a lot of light as to why there are some answers that didn't come out of Yonkers, and why at some point in time they weren't talking too much. So I find this really interesting. Again, more so attached to some other things that I'm researching. But she was on it. She was on it. And I love the way in her interview she says, "My attorney Spencer Lader. My attorney Spencer Lader." Bless her heart.
As for the killer's nickname, the New York Post says Berkowitz told police that Sam is 64-year-old Sam Carr, a Yonkers neighbor who runs a telephone answering service. Berkowitz is quoted as saying that Carr drove him crazy. Carr says Berkowitz launched a hate mail campaign against him. He adds that he went to the police 3 weeks ago to complain about Berkowitz, and last Saturday he went again and told them he was sure Berkowitz was the man they were looking for. But in the end, it was a parking ticket that led to Berkowitz's arrest. He's being held without bail, and a judge has ordered that he be given a mental competence test. Now this...
Okay, so we'll just do this other part, and then I will come back, fix my lighting rather, so I don't look like Casper, and come back on screen with you. Anyway, I want you to be able to see this. So we spoke of her advocacy, and I just thought these were really interesting pictures. So just jumping back, and this one's cool. Let me see if I could zoom in. John Deal's in this picture. And you can see Neysa in the corner. I mean, she was in the media. She was there. But anyhow, just to give you the temperature of this time, you're looking at Berkowitz trying to act like a crazy lunatic. And now the victims are thinking that this guy might get off with this insanity plea. And who knows how long he would stay in a state mental facility. They were on this. They were really on this. And Neysa was right there, front and center. So I just really wanted to share those few photos. But look, we have become targets for murderers. It's a waste of our tax money to support murderers in hotels. Is Son of Sam on vacation? I mean, these people were outraged. And he didn't fool Neysa. She says, even from the interview clips that I shared with you, he was not crazy. I mean, he was crazy, but he knew what he was doing. He was not crazy. He knew exactly. He said, in her words, she said he was cunning. Okay.
on a quiet place overseas, and year after year, the kid has to hear the do's and don'ts and the dares. And when she's 10 years old, she thinks that rock and roll, but Poppy bangs it from the home. But for the grace of
All right, so I'm going to drive the point of advocacy home with this excerpt from the New York Post. Wasn't that a great little clip? That movie alone, for the flavor, was worth the view. So in 1999, Spike Lee puts out Summer of Sam. A year prior, Neysa reaches out to his office because she wants to offer information that will help represent her daughter and the victims in a good light. So it's a short excerpt. I'm just going to read it to you. New York Post, Son of Sam victims kin rip Spike. It's by Steve Dunleavy, and it was written June 24th, 1999, or was published rather. So here's the excerpt, and I'll start with the Neysa Moskowitz, and then I'll jump back and explain to you, give you a little more context. Neysa Moskowitz, mother of Stacy Moskowitz, Berkowitz's last victim, was similarly outraged. Last year, when myself and my daughter, Ricky, heard about the movie coming out, we called Spike Lee's office, Neysa told me from Miami. So when she says she was similarly outraged, she's talking about Mike Lauria, Donna Lauria's dad, because he was actually highlighted in this article, but this is a Neysa Moskowitz video. So I didn't want to read that all to you. I just wanted to grab the excerpt. But Mike Lauria was outraged with this movie, and so were other victims similarly. So Neysa is saying that she reached out a year prior because she wanted to offer her input. We were quite willing to give him any help just to make sure Stacy and the other little victims were portrayed in the right light. Strange choice of words there. Yes, I agree with Mike, Mr. Lauria, that the kids were not portrayed properly for all these years. I mean, kids kissing in the front seat of a car, to be really bad. She was in everything, wasn't she? But anyhow, just again to recap that, and I'm happy to put this on our community page if you want to read the whole thing, or you could just do a search yourself, Son of Sam victims kin rip Spike. And it's interesting because, you know, Donna Lauria's father was a huge advocate. I mean, they all were, and for good reason. But again, today we're talking Neysa, so I just wanted to give you that last tidbit of information before we move on to the next topic. So hope you found that part interesting. Let's go forward. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be jumping around a little bit, but I promise you that at the end, I will do a good summary based on my notes with a little bit better timeline. So here, well, let's blow out the picture first. And we're looking at circa 1991. And I'll just read it to you because it's just so much easier that way. 1991, outside the CBS broadcast studios on West 57th Street in Manhattan are David Berkowitz, confidant Lee Chase, we'll come back to that, Neysa Moskowitz, Maury Terry, and Joe Basteri, a retired NYPD homicide detective who was one of the first chosen members of the 1977 Son of Sam task force. By 1979, Basteri supported the SOS conspiracy investigation. At the time of the photo in 1991, the Geraldo Rivera hosted nightly news magazine program, Now It Can Be Told, where Maury was a staff member, was airing a 5-part series on the Son of Sam conspiracy. I dug on that. I have a little information here in blue. I couldn't find the episodes, although I found a few others, but I didn't find the Now It Can Be Told. So if anybody has that, share it. Or put it up, make a video, put it up. This was 2 years before Berkowitz himself spoke out for the very first time in exclusive interviews with Maury for Inside Edition. So I did look, and there was a show that existed. Now it can be told. It appears Maury was on staff, and they were filming something. But I guess nothing groundbreaking. When I came upon this, it's like by 1991, we have Neysa Moskowitz hobnobbing with Maury, Basteri, and Lee Chase. So I guess I just find that interesting. By 91, this was the company that she kept. Although keep in mind, she was already in Florida, we believe. So she might have come up for this special event. I don't know if the picture was for this 5-part Son of Sam series, which I found very interesting. If anybody has that, I want to check that out. I went on Geraldo's website, looked through his archives. I couldn't find it, but if it exists and anybody has it, you need to share that. We like the archives. We learned something from everything. But yeah, by 91, this was her posse. And I will go a little deeper into Basteri, not today, but I will give you a quickie clip so you know who he is. And then we will also talk about Lee Chase, okay? So we've got that coming up. Basteri, we're going to go a little deeper into Lee Chase and Maury Terry and their relationship, what was going on. That's not today. Today's Neysa. My point today was just bringing up the fact that by 91, we're going to premieres with Maury Terry, Basteri, retired NYPD homicide detective. He retired in 78. And Lee Chase, a la D Channel. But we will come back to this. Okay, let's move on to the Basteri clip. I'm going to jump back to our final topic before summary, was just filling in some gaps on the forgiveness, the relationship between Neysa Moskowitz and David Berkowitz. And I didn't want you to get bored, so I'm bringing up the penthouse. Okay. So this article, entitled David Berkowitz, is from January 2000, and it was written by Lisa Singh. I'm not doing the article. Most of you have this. It's posted in all the groups, but I just really pulled into context. I was trying to get a little timeline. That's my thing. And I just pulled out the Neysa excerpt. That piece of garbage. He's walking around while my daughters are dead. No, she said, shaking her head. It's not even Stephen. He did terrible things and people forget it. Her voice rising, her mouth drawn in disgust, she added, they look at him like a little god. If he wasn't in jail, he wouldn't be with the Bibles. What was he before? A nothing. He worked in a mailroom. He has a little power. Come on, that would make anyone drunk. He doesn't deserve to live. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If it's good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for me. I'll say it until the day I die. So that's a really powerful statement. And I'm going to be straight up front with you. Her statements get a little muddy in terms of timeline. I mentioned this earlier in the video. A lot of periodicals republished articles, but we're going to try to make some heads or tails of that. But before we do that, we are going to take a look at Berkowitz's account of his relationship with Mrs. Moskowitz. So this is from Arise and Shine, and this is Mrs. Moskowitz Part I. See if we get this a little bigger so we can read. The Journal 1 Part 1 was written September 1st, 2003. My family, as well as my many friends, know how much I grieve over the past and how sorry I am for the crimes I committed at a time when my life was out of control and my thoughts were demonic and twisted. God knows that if it were possible, I would do all that I could to undo those crimes. But acts like this cannot be undone. To believe so would only be wishful thinking. Well, I'm going to skip down to the timeline with Mrs. Moskowitz. Okay, on December 8, 2001, I was able to talk to Mrs. Moskowitz over the phone. It was wonderful. Being able to speak to her and apologize was for me a dream come true. Over time, our relationship began to progress. We exchanged letters. I made a few more calls. In addition, on 3 occasions, I was even able to send her money, which she was exceedingly grateful for, as she is now a widow with only meager finances. Okay, so let me jump back there. So this is saying in 2001 he spoke to her on the phone. The Penthouse article was 2000, okay? So you've got, of course, in the beginning, her hating Berkowitz, wanting the death penalty, advocating for gun control, fighting the insanity plea, all that good stuff. She meets with Dunleavy over a drink, and she had disparaging things to say about Berkowitz. Again, the Penthouse interview. But here, they get the phone call. They have the phone call on December 8th, 2001. We know prior to this, they had exchange of letters. And I'm not going to go through all of Berkowitz's words. You can read this yourself on his website. But I will go to this part that I have highlighted. I have kept a log of all the letters I mailed to Mrs. Moskowitz. My first letter to her was a 10-page typed letter that was dated July 25th, 1998. Over time, I would write more letters to Mrs. Moskowitz. She was answering almost every letter. Recently, though, all the letters I received from her, I turned over to my attorney, Hugo R. Harmatz, for safekeeping. I held on to these letters, which I cherished dearly for a long time, but I felt that her letters were not safe here, so he has them. So let's jump back to that. We know that there was a lawsuit because then Harmatz was writing a book, and which I purchased, and I told you that in episode 1, and he didn't want these letters published, and they weren't. He published other letters from Christian fans of Berkowitz, but the Moskowitz letters were not in there. So he gave them to Harmatz for safekeeping and then sued him and got his property back, which included the letters, personal pictures, stuff like that. So we'll jump back. And then we're going to go to September 4th, 2003, and this is part 2. And I'm only going through the highlighted. If I had the opportunity to meet with Mrs. Berkowitz, I could have shared many things with her to erase her mind, as well as confess my guilt. And I am confident and I believe by faith that one day this will happen. Then when it does, both our lives shall be better as a result. Okay? So he was upset that they didn't meet. Remember, we talked about her wanting it televised. She wanted to find out what happened to Stacy. She wanted information from Berkowitz, and he backed out. He did not want this stuff televised. So we're going to revisit this snippet, The Devil in David Berkowitz by Steve Fishman. And Neysa, whatever forgiveness she may have once expressed, blames David alone. She has a letter from him that settles the matter for her. I hope that one day you will forgive me for taking your daughter's life, he wrote. Remember, I shared that in episode 1, and that was at the time of her death. So after Fishman's article, September 30th, 2006, Berkowitz puts out, it was on December 8, 2001 that a quiet and private miracle took place between 2 ordinary people and the creator of the universe. The mother of murder victim Stacy Moskowitz and I talked to each other over the telephone. With her permission, I called Neysa Moskowitz from the prison's recreation yard. She was living in Florida at the time. Neysa died alone. It hasn't hit me yet that she's really gone, and even though we'd lost touch and haven't communicated for several years, I will miss her. But for this, I am going to jump back to my last presentation because it brings us back to that meeting that they were supposed to have where David backs out. Going to be filmed. Here we go. It was going to be filmed for TV. Neysa says she wanted information about the murder of her daughter. David backed out. I couldn't in my heart. It would be a circus. I had personal things to share. I didn't want to be used, he says. So thereafter, the relationship fell apart. Neysa's forgiveness was withdrawn. David tells me glumly, she's back to hating me. So back and forth and back and forth. Okay, jumping back. Okay, so there is one other part in the beginning of this video. I told you I'd cover a little bit on Stacy with the timeline, so I'm going to bring that up, and then we will be ready for our summary of today's video. Kind of recap what was discussed. Hopefully you have some comments and questions, and we'll have some dialogue and comments that might bring up some more. So let me grab that timeline slide. All right, so this part is just a quickie. We talked about all of Neysa's family, and so I thought I'd take a minute or two just to show you the basics of the slide. Sunday, July 31st, 1977, approximately 2:35 a.m., Shore Parkway Service Road at 17th Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. Victims: Stacy Moskowitz, 20, gunshot wound to the head, deceased. Robert Violante, 20, gunshot wound to the head, survived, blinded from his injuries. As you can see on this slide from the timeline, they are pictured here. There are links to newspaper articles. There are links to Berkowitz's letters talking about the crimes. There are links to police photos, police reports, and sketches. And of course, the fun part, the little side links, and we have a whole insert on the infamous parking ticket. Not going to show that today. This is Neysa. Just wanted to give you a little bit on Stacy, and I figured I'd use the opportunity to highlight the crime slide. So let's move on to the summary portion. Okay, let's wrap this baby up. So I've got a summary on screen. I know I presented a lot of information, and even after the fact, when I went ahead and researched some of the research, I had a few things that I added. So if the summary is not quite exact or complete, don't worry. My presentations are going to be combined. They're going to be cleaned up. Any repetitious stuff will be taken out. Any new stuff will be put in, and then eventually it will make its way to the timeline. And if there's anything that you need, you can always reach out to the channel. All right, so quick summary. In '68, Neysa loses Jody Lynn. July 1977, Stacy is shot and dies shortly thereafter. August 77, Yonkers lawsuit is announced. Also, Neysa announces that in conjunction with her lawyer, she is contemplating producing a movie. March 1981, the first reported attack by alleged cult members. May 1981, second reported attack. Of course, we mentioned that the police investigated them and they came up empty. Don't forget to go back to part 1 if you haven't seen that. By July 1983, the details of the attacks change. So they go from 2 attacks to 3 or 4 attacks. It also changes a little bit in detail. There was 2 on the second attack that jumped through or climbed through the terrace window and then jumped 25 feet down. By 83, that attack happened outside. Now, I will say maybe there was another reported attack that I'm unaware of that was outside, but I don't think so. I just think that the details changed by 83. So in 91, we see her at the Geraldo premiere with Maury Terry, Lee Chase, and Basteri. In the early 1990s, she moves to Florida with her husband. In 94, her husband Jerry dies. In 99, the Spike Lee movie comes out, and she states that a year prior, her and Ricky reached out to Spike Lee's office to try and offer information for that project. In 1999, Ricky Beth passes away. In 2000, Berkowitz writes. We actually learned today that it was 98. I believe he started his 10-page letter. So it sounds like between the time of the first phone call, which was 2001, from 98 to 2001, there was correspondence that was going back and forth. I think it's safe to say that. Again, 2001, Berkowitz calls. 2003, Berkowitz, Neysa Part 1 and 2 come out on the Arise and Shine, where he already explains that because of that in-person meeting that they were supposed to have where the media was not able to come, or they wanted to come and Berkowitz backed out of it. After that, they were on the outs, okay? Remember, I'm sorry, I skipped over it. In 2000, that Penthouse article came out. So she had pretty vicious things to say for that Penthouse article. Now, just to back it up, they might have gotten that quote from an earlier quote. So just keep that in mind. It's important that we keep the details in mind, but we also keep an open mind that, just because it's reported in a magazine or a newspaper doesn't make it all true, right? We're taking what we have and then we use our brain and we kind of assess the information from there, okay? So I skipped out of sequence there, so let me jump back into this. In 2006, the Devil Inside David article comes out, and that's where basically they're saying, per her last correspondence with David, where he admits that he took her daughter, there was no forgiveness. And then in September 2006, Neysa passes away. And I will touch lightly. Keep in mind that there were softer words from her neighbor, Mrs. DeNaro, her friend and neighbor, but that was memorializing her. So it makes sense to me that they put something a little more flowery, that in the end she wanted peace and she forgave everybody. But her quote right before her death says something very different. So anyway, that's a quick summary. I'm going to come back to you with a little bit more information about the Maury, Basteri, Chase, and Neysa, or probably not as much Neysa, but more about what those three cats were doing, so that might help also fill some of these gaps. So I hope that you enjoyed today's presentation. It certainly was really cool to put together. Love digging deep into these things. Again, I know it's not monumental, but I've always had a curiosity about Neysa Moskowitz and the family, and just what a sad story it was. So this has been an interesting adventure for me, just finding out more. And again, I hope that we've had some really great discussion. Who knows, it might lead to other things. Now, the last thing I'll touch on is we did mention the lawsuit in Yonkers. So, I'm going to be coming back to that, not necessarily just in relation to Neysa, but just that whole Yonkers scene as a whole. So again, hope you enjoyed. Thank you for being here. Was he forgiven? Who knows? It doesn't sound that way to me. But remember, we all grieve in our own ways. We all try to find forgiveness because the act of forgiveness is really about setting ourselves free. We may not always forgive the people that hurt us, but sometimes we just have to for our own sanity. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and until the next one, peace.